Joining us for this online discussion is a good friend of mine, Adam Kramer. Adam is a writer at Bleacher Report, and he specializes in college football. And Adam also, I think, is one of the best interviewers in sports journalism today. So, Adam, thank you so much for being with us today. Just to begin with, can you give a little more background, a little more detail on how you got to Bleacher Report and just sort of how you got into the business?
Sure. I kind of got into it organically. I did not go to journalism school. So that's a huge advantage that others had before me. And I started a blog about 10 years ago. Kegs and Eggs was the name of the blog. At the time, I was a fan. So it was an outlet to get my stupid and sometimes ridiculous thoughts onto the internet. And honestly, before I could really write, I think I had a knack for Twitter. I was able to operate 140 characters, and the thought process that went into generating a tweet that people would like was something that I just like to do, and that I think I was better at than I was at actual writing. Over time, as the blog started to change and evolve and got more serious, eventually I talked to Bleacher Report, began writing 3 to 5 columns a week for them. That was mainly assessments of games, depth charts, that kind of a thing. And the evolution of Bleacher Report has allowed me now to do more in-depth feature writing, which was a slow process in itself. You start to Q&As, and then ultimately a few years later, stuff you're working on, Lars, is 3,000 to 5,000 word stories where you're interviewing dozens of people and trying to capture tales that maybe people aren't telling now.
Okay, so since this discussion, we're going to try to keep it focused on interviewing as much as possible. Now, you and I met, I think it was 3 years ago at Big Ten Media Days. And I think we were just sort of randomly sitting close to one another.
We were, yeah.
And what I remember, and this is telling because I think it's important when it comes to interviewing, was the ease with which you and I talked. And I think that's such a big part of interviewing is making the other person who you don't know feel comfortable. And I automatically felt comfortable with you, and I think you felt comfortable with me. And I don't know if that's necessarily something you can teach, or is it? Is that just something you have, or what do you think?
It's a really great point, and I've talked about this a lot in how you word a question, the order in which you word questions, and just the way your natural delivery is going to change the content that you get. I generally am a guy, I'm saying buddy and friend. I'm just that guy. Like, I'm just a guy that naturally feels like I can sit up next to you and we can have a drink at the bar. Like, that's just my natural disposition. There's no question that helps when you're interviewing certain people. Maybe not with others. There may be the rare person who just wants to get down to it and it may rub them the wrong way. But for the most part, human beings, if you make them feel comfortable, and you ease into the conversation and the items that you have, you're 100% right, Lars, and you know this too, is allowing someone to actually distance themselves from the fact that they're doing an interview and just make it a conversation, to me is without a doubt the times where you'll get the best material and you're there talking. You forget about the fact that there's a tape recorder down there, and you just start to learn a little bit about the subject that you're diving into.
I also think it's important that you don't just view the person you're talking to as a subject. Yeah, like you said, they're a person. And as part of that conversation, you need to give of yourself. Yep. So you need to share sort of some level of intimacy with the person that you're talking with. And I know that can be hard with a stranger, but I always try to, I always research whoever I'm going to be talking to. And if there's something we have in common, even if it's the fact that we both have, kids, I will ask about their kid, and I'll share some anecdote about how my kid just threw up on me. It humanizes me, and it makes me not just the reporter, but like you said, just like a guy who shares the same sort of experiences as the person I'm talking to.
And that took some time. Like, first and foremost, knowing the amount of proper research that needs to go into each individual interview, like you said, is huge, because there will be something there that you want to draw out of them, and there'll be parallels that you can make to yourselves that will help. There is that awkwardness in that first 30 seconds of an interview, especially over the phone with me, where it's like you never just want to sit down and say, so and look at your list of questions. And I'm a little bit neurotic in that way. I'm writing down all the questions. I never follow it, but it's almost like if you were reading a speech at a wedding, right? I would never write the speech word for word, but I at least want to have an outline of what my interview is going to look like and the material at least that I want to cover. So with the person that I sit down to interview, if you can bring it together on a personal level, for me, with college kids, it's a lot easier. To relating to, 18 to 22-year-olds, I'm still not, I like to consider myself at least young at heart. It's something that I think I'm able to still accomplish. It's a little bit more difficult with a guy like, say, Nick Saban, but you can still find that way to do that. But above all, having someone before you get what you feel like you need to get, it really is a conversation. An interview is such a strong word, and they know, the person that you're talking to knows you're trying to draw something out of them. Not necessarily to make them say something they'll regret, but they know the structure of the arrangement here. So to try and distance yourself from that arrangement and make it like you're just talking is really, really important.
Yeah, it's the few times that I've spoke with Saban, we've actually played a little bit of golf together, and so I use that every time I see him. When I walk into his office, first thing I'll say is, "How's your golf game, brother?" And then we'll start and we will talk about golf way too long, and I'm kind of looking at my watch, saying, "Oh man, it's eating up my 15 minutes," but I'd rather feel at ease for like 5 minutes, than just try to force the questions out. All right, just sort of. How, when you go into an interview, do you, like you said, I write my questions down, but I don't necessarily follow the script. You do the same thing?
I do the same thing. I like to have a fresh new notepad every time. I'm probably not trees probably hate me in the way I go about things. I'm trying to conserve that a little bit more now, but I like to have everything, at least that I want to discuss, there on the paper, right there in front of me, where I'm asking about if it's the origins of a player, his hometown, which things I already know going in. For me, there's just a comfort in having these materials that if, take, for example, certain college athletes, and this is just closer to my world, you'll talk to some kids who just have 7-word answers. Nick Saban will have a 700-word answer. So you'll run in position as an interviewer that maybe you're still trying to, in your mind, process where you want to go with an interview. That happens to me at times. Having sort of some of these safety nets of stuff that I know I want to go over is hugely important. And then the other thing, and this is really good advice, and I can't remember where I got it, but I got it a few years ago. When you're in an interview, or when I'm in an interview, and you get that answer that you think is going to help you. When I was first starting to interview people, it's like, ding, ding, I got it. Right? Like, that is going to be huge for me. But and I forget who told me this, but rather just say, you got what you got, go on to the next thing. No. You gotta hammer away. You need to keep going and diving in. And just because you think you got it, you probably don't. And honestly, as I've interviewed more people and I've figured out, like, oh, this is something, this is a person that explains this pretty well, and this is something that's going to be valuable in the story I write. That's ultimately keep focusing in, because there's ultimately more that you can draw out of that.
And how much research do you do on your interview subject before the interview even starts?
A lot. I do hours. And again, for me, normally, if I'm writing about, say, a star college football player and I'm talking to his mom, well, I need to know that it's college football player, where he's from, about him growing up. But I need to know about the parents too. I need to try and figure out, where they work, what his upbringing. I want to try and know as much as I possibly can, so that when I'm in an interview, I think part of making people comfortable too in an interview is showing that you've put in the time. If you can go into an interview and not sputter all over yourself and ask pretty basic questions that are readily available, you're eliminating the need to ask questions that you don't need to ask. I think that's kind of important too, because you mentioned time. In a lot of these situations, time is everything, because you're not going to have 2 or 3 hours with somebody. So knowing that you can get this stuff out there is really important. But I try to dive in as much as possible, whether it's bios, whether it's, it's amazing now if you just Google somebody and dive in for an hour and a half, what you can find. So I try and do as much as that as I can. And then the other thing to that is kind of the structure of an interview. I have a story coming up this week that I know the subject pretty well, and I've done some interviews. But the moment you unlock, say, an interview or two beforehand, your questions change entirely. So I like to stagger my interviews a little bit if I can, because I know that when I talk to people, the more I do, I'm just going to build on the interviews I have from that moving forward.
One thing that I like to do and what I preach to students is I try, if possible, to get the subject out of a conference room.
Yes.
And say, hey, if it's a college kid, let's go for a walk across campus. Go show me your dorm. If it's someone else, I'd love to get people into cars and have them driving and have them show me their old neighborhood, because when they're driving, they don't have to worry about eye contact. And if you're just sort of doing another activity, it seems to foster really good conversation as well.
100%. And I think there's a variety of different reasons that the conference room setup is very rigid. It's cold. It takes a while to loosen up in a place like that. If you can get somebody out, whether it's a walk, you mentioned car, I think that's a really, fun and unique idea, because again, they're not necessarily focused on what they're saying. They're focused on probably not driving their car into a pole and you into it. So right. And also I think this allows for some pretty unique reporting opportunities as well. So you don't know what you're going to find in that car, but you may find something. You're going to see that person's car. So you drive in a big old truck with a bumper sticker that has some significance. What else are you going to learn about them? So I think the more you can get away from their environment, and for me, it's football operations buildings, it's stadiums, go to a restaurant, go eat with somebody, watch what they order, what mannerisms are they doing. I think that the further away you can get from their football comfort zone and the place that most of these interviews are taking, the better answers you get, the better opportunities to draw something else out of it that you'll get as well.
I remember one time I did a story on, shows my age, Vashon Leonard. He was a basketball player for Minnesota or he played for Minnesota in college and then went off and played in the NBA. And I knew that he was back home in Minnesota, and so I requested to interview him on his home court. And I brought a basketball so I could get him. I could interview him while he's shooting on his home court. So I'm automatically setting up a scene in which I can lead from, and it's all based on the interview and the place. And sometimes the place of the interview is actually as important, I think, as the interview itself. Go ahead.
No, it is. We look for that unique moment, like starting an interview in a room with just normal drywall. In the place that he always speaks, you'll probably get what you need out of it. But again, that when you can have the opportunity and not just ask questions, but ask questions in a unique environment and try and relate that back to how you're going to build a story together. It's kind of where reporting, you're no longer just reporting on the questions, but you're seeing a little side to the human beings. Like sports, to me, the fun part about doing this is we're able to kind of peel back the layers of them as an athlete. Okay, if you're writing about an athlete and what they do in the field, the moment you can get them away from that as far as they possibly can and do something fun, then I think you can really start to build on the material you have.
So a different kind of interview is the man on the street interview, which I think you're good at because of just the sort of, the jovial guy who you are. And that leads me to the Nick Saban statue story. I think we have discussed it a few times, but just take us to how you did that and how you approached people, and just explain just a little bit for the students what that story is.
Yeah, so this was a unique idea. Again, I like to put myself in unique game day situations. And on Saturday, I spent the entire day, literally from like 5:30 in the morning till about 8 at night, standing outside Nick Saban's statue in Tuscaloosa and watching people, talking to people. We got some great photos. You got some great videos. It's one of the most passionate football hubs on the planet. And I did this for last fall's Texas A&M game. And so, it is the scary thing. And I like this. I mean, the scary in a good way about this story is you have no idea where it's going to take you. If I'm writing about a topic or a subject, I know that I'm gonna be able to get this and do research. I researched the Nick Saban statue. I've realized what it's made of. I figure out how they clean it. I realized when it got there. I talked to the statue people. That's not going to help me when I'm standing out there with 200, 10,000 drunk people talking to them about football. There's a little bit of an unknown that goes to this, but I think that's a good thing. So with something like that, and it is, you feel a little bit salesman-y. I don't want it to come off that way when I'm standing around a crowd of people and saying, putting a tape recorder in their face. It can't possibly be that way. I always tell them, why I'm there and I'm doing the story. And you know what? For the most part, people are cool. And then you really just start to talk about them, their lives. Interesting thing about that story, actually, is there's a decent amount of content that we cut out about unique people that I ran into who had overcome some, pretty difficult times in their lives to get to that point. But my point, I want to talk to as many people as I can, get as many perspectives as I can, watch as many people as I can. And with a story like that, as important as it might be to interview some people to get some perspective that you may use, really the most important thing about something like that is your eyes. And you're watching people and you're studying people. And if you see something unique, maybe you go over and politely ask them about it. And then you're kind of registering it as you go.
Just a little note keeping here. Do you take physical notes while you tape record, or you just rely on the tape recorder?
I do both. I rely on the tape recorder, but if something really stands out to me, I will take physical notes. Also, what someone is wearing, what status they're in, what is their body doing. So while they're talking, I'm usually kind of trying to capture the situation. The other thing I do, now I'm not going to do this while someone's talking. I'm not going to go up to Nick Saban and put a cell phone in his face and take a picture of him, but I am one that relies a lot on pictures. Like if I'm in a situation, an environment where I know I'm going to be talking to someone, I'm taking photos, I'm writing down notes, and then as a backup, as like a fail-safe, I'm definitely trying to use the tape recorder as well.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I always have a tape recorder going, but I've been burned. My tape recorder shuts off. It shuts off. It happens. It really happens. Yep. So it's always good to have those physical notes. And I've developed a shorthand over the years that only I can understand, but it works for me.
It's like my worst nightmare, by the way. I've had it happen 2 or 3 times. One time I lost not just like one interview, but 5 or 6. And this was years ago before I was really capturing the art of like the backup note taking. I remember for a while after that, I walked around with 2 tape recorders. I did. I mean, just being the goof that I was, I'd just like slide them in. People kind of look like, all right, that seems like a bit much. But you're right. Then you learn you kind of develop your own language. You can put together your own quotes. And this is something you're great at, Lars, and it's something I'm definitely moving away from. You can tell someone's story without having them tell it in quotes really well. And ultimately, if you're writing down notes, you don't have to know exactly word for word what this person is saying. You may, and obviously you want to include some of those things, but trying to distance myself from purely delivering quote for quote what someone is trying to say and capture that myself for them, I think is something that I'm trying to do more of, and something you do really, really well.
Thank you on that. All right. So the other story that students are going to read is about Josh Allen, who potentially is the #1 overall draft pick in 2018. He's a quarterback out of Wyoming. And this is a different kind of story because you embedded basically out there in Nowheresville, Wisconsin for a few days, or Wyoming for a few days. How are those kind of interviews different than the Saban statue story interviews?
Well, depending on a lot of it starts with where you're going and access too. So a place like Wyoming is going to open their doors a little bit wider than a place like Alabama, and that's just the reality. And that's going to ultimately change the way you report. But when you go out to Laramie, and I love to go to weird. Not weird, that makes Laramie sound strange, but I like to go to different places that we're not often visiting on the map. And Laramie was certainly one of those. I got there a day early and just walked around town and just got the vibe of the town. I talked to people, I talked to students, I talked to everybody, just try and get the flavor of this city, because part of the story is the potential #1 overall pick is coming from a place that doesn't often produce football talent, and what that place is like and how he got there. So as you're kind of setting that up, obviously I think first and foremost with that specific topic, it's not just about him. It's about his path. I talked to his parents who are out in Fireball, California, weeks leading up to this put together, I mentioned staggering interviews. I know exactly who Josh Allen is. by talking to coaches and parents, whoever, before I even come close to sitting down with him and before I come close to sitting down to his coaches. So there was definitely a level of preparedness heading into that I felt really good about before we even got to Wyoming.
And when you're out there, how'd the interviews go with Josh and with the coaching staff? Was it kind of where you just kind of bumped around from office to office? I love those. I've had similar situations where I'm just sort of with the program for like 2 or 3 days.
Yep.
And they get so comfortable with you. It's just like it's like you just are hanging out, and I love that.
Well, you mentioned going outside the offices with Josh. It was a request I made. It was one they happily granted. And so Josh and I went to a little barbecue dump down the street, and I walked in, and I'll never forget it. Josh walks into it, and the cashier's eyes light up, and he's got his order ready to go before he even says anything. And you talk about reporting access points. That was one of them.
Dude, I mean, that's so great. I mean, you never would have got that if you played by if you played by the rules and you just did it in the conference room, and that could be a potential lead for your story, and that illustrates so much.
Exactly. So it's a small thing, right? But it's hugely important, and it's a detail that you'll never get. No one will ever get. So something like that, the minute I walk in, you see that cashier's face, and you see the way they interact. That's something. You sit him down at a table in the corner, all right? You're just talking about life and football. You got noises in the back. You're eating lunch. Everybody's off guard, myself included. You're just getting to know this guy. It was an honest, open interview about a kid who's just been torn in so many different directions. It's funny too. After that, I went back to the office. I talked to some of the coaches, met with Craig Bowl in his office, had a great interview, very honest interview. I go to transcribe some of my notes at Starbucks, and sure enough, he's sitting next to me. And so we ended up talking for about 30 more minutes, and much looser environment. It worked out by chance, but another situation where you'll get lucky sometimes, and the interview was great, the content was great, but also just you're putting yourself in some situations, and you open up yourself to a coach that, I'm sitting in Starbucks, he's sitting in Starbucks. If he didn't like my shtick in his office, he's just going to put his paper up and ignore me. But we ended up having a really great conversation about it. So it's just you don't really realize it. But it's the small little things that you may do throughout an interview or throughout a visit that you're setting yourself up to succeed.
Now, talking to people who you don't know is inherently difficult.
It is.
And I think by nature, I'm somewhat introverted. And so it's always been hard for me. And even like today or whenever, next time I have to go up to somebody in a locker room, it's still sort of hard. What advice would you give to a college student who has this fear, of going and talking to people? I mean, to me, I just tell them, buddy, you just got to do it. But do you have anything that you could add to that?
The more you do it, the less nervous you will get. But meeting people is hard. Like, I don't care. And again, I'm pretty comfortable doing it. But if I see, when I'm standing outside Nick Saban's statue and I have to go talk to a little old lady standing by it who probably has no idea who I am or has no idea or may not want anything to do with me, approaching her is not something I'm like jumping for joy at. All right. But it's something you have to do. And it's something ultimately I want to do. When you go up to someone though, and you first ask them, hey, how are you doing? And you introduce yourself and you talk a little bit about what you're doing, and you just kind of, again, just talk, just interact and talk. I think it becomes easier. Again, you mentioned it, bringing it to yourself. Before I go up to someone and say, hey, I want to do this. Hey, my name's Adam Kramer. I almost turn it on me, like to focus on myself before we get to them, to try and just say, this is who I am, and this is kind of what I'm all about. Granted, that still makes it hard to do. I think the repetition part of this is huge. The more you do it, the easier it becomes, the more natural you'll get in front of people. I joke about this with my wife all the time. Public speaking has never necessarily been an issue for me, and it drives her nuts. And I try to help her out a little bit with just some cues, saying, hey, it's not so much imagine everybody in the room naked. No, that's not it. It's just if you allow yourself to almost let your guard down a little bit, and just be yourself, the awkwardness in the way you talk, the rawness of your voice, the openness and honesty in the way you talk to people. People like that. They don't want you buttoned up. So if you allow yourself to kind of be just who you are, which can be easier said than done, then ultimately I think the interview will go smoothly.
This really isn't germane to anything we're talking about, but a friend of mine has this shtick where he whenever he has to give a toast at a wedding, he always begins the toast by saying, "Oh, I forgot my notes in my hotel room, so forgive me." So all of a sudden, expectations are lowered, and the guy just kills it every time. So maybe that's the same thing for us when we're interviewing someone. Just you can say, "Oh, sorry, I've been rushed," and you can diminish the expectations, but whatever works.
And also too, like just asking someone how their day is going, it may seem small, but it's also like you're showing some care in this individual as a person before asking them, hey, what do you think of this or that, or diving into your material. Like you mentioned Nick Saban's golf game, that it's a small gesture and it's a small gateway of introduction to a conversation, but those small things can go a long way in just making you both immediately comfortable once you start talking.
Well, hey, this has been great. Thank you so much, Adam. Look forward to keep reading your work on Bleacher Report, and students can keep checking you out on Bleacher. And thanks again, and we will stay in touch. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, Lars. We'll talk soon.